When we are live, we'll start then. Okay, I think we are. A very warm welcome to one and all. Um, we are back with our uh, year long lecture series called An Evening with an Expert. And with us today, we have Dr. Souvik Naha. And it's my pleasure to welcome him today to the session. And I'll provide a brief introduction of Dr. Naha to everyone who's listening to today's lecture. Currently, he is a senior lecturer in Imperial and Post-colonial history at University of Glasgow. His doctoral research at ETH Zurich, funded by a Swiss government excellence scholarship, examined how journalists and broadcasters popularized cricket as an ideal everyday leisure activity in 20th century Calcutta. After completing his PhD, Dr. Naha taught history at the West Bengal State University and the Indian Institute of Management, Rohtak. Prior to joining Glasgow, he held a Marie Slodowska, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
That's against
Um,
Clodos.
okay, um, pardon me, which is a fellowship at Durham University. This project extended his work on decolonization by examining cricket's significance as a tool of reshaping Indo British relationship after India's independence, focusing on issues of race, mobility, migration, diplomacy, and environment. His upcoming book is titled Cricket, Public Culture, and the Making of Post Colonial Calcutta, to be published by Cambridge University Press. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Neha, for the rather kind introduction, and to Shubham as well for inviting me to speak over here. I'm really thrilled because you have considered me to be an expert and you have been willing to listen to whatever I have to say. So I was really debating what really to speak about because I found it very hard to really fix it on the topic. Initially I was just thinking about speaking about my forthcoming book, which I'm really excited about, but then I thought maybe it would be better to talk about the next project that I'm working on because it will be really very beneficial for me to speak about this project and get your feedback on whether my ideas are going in the right direction or not. So any suggestions, comments, criticism are very much welcome at this point because I've barely just began working on this project. So this new project has been it has produced some outputs already. It started with a conference that I co-organized with Boria Mujumdar in 2019 in Oxford. It led to an edited collection of this journal called Sport in Society on cricket and 21st century nationhoods. Then it has also led to another edited volume, which is forthcoming with Oxford University Press. It's called Cricket and 21st Century Nationhoods, like identity politics in uncertain times. And now I'm thinking of writing a monograph based on the basic notion of how cricket has contributed to the making of nations, nationalism, and national identity in the 21st century, and how it really differs with how cricket has been producing identities such as these in the 1940s or the 1950s, which is the period of decolonization, which is the kind of research that I'm undertaking right now. So this is the next step of the current project that I'm engaged in. So my main contention about this is that cricket has generated context and mechanisms for creating, promoting, displaying, and legitimizing nationalism and national identity in some countries in the world, especially the test playing nations, and most potently in South Asia. We can argue that cricket has been a deep play element in global society, to quote Clifford Geertz, and it provides a vantage point for us to understand how nationalism and national identity has worked in the 19th and 20th centuries, and more powerfully in the wake of decolonization since the 1950s, after which a lot more countries have started playing cricket at the international level, and the competition between different international sides have heated up, and new issues of nationalism, nation making, and nation building have influenced the dynamics of cricket on and off the field like little else in the countries which take cricket very seriously, such as ours, India. Not just cricketers, but especially, in fact, more than cricketers, the cricket loving people, the cricket followers, they are readily drawn into the nationalist or nationalized identifications around the sport. They channel a certain form of national optimism, they articulate national aspiration. So, all these aspirations and these dynamics have made cricket a political project through which national and collective identity are defined. And as such, cricket has been intricately entangled with various territorial or emotional epitomes of identity. So these are the epitomes or the systemic identifications of cricket with nationhood that I would like to pursue in this research project. So why do I talk about the 21st century in this project? So, why is it important? Uh, if we go back to what the historian Tony Judd had said in 2010, noting the immense political convulsions in the last 2 decades before that, so he called the 21st century an age of insecurity. For him, insecurity was this paralyzing fear of change, of decline, of strangers, and an unfamiliar world, which people thought would subvert the social and liberal democratic idea of a civil society. We have seen commitment to diversity, equality, tolerance, but all of these have been a double edged sword at their best. People have had faith in state led justice and human rights. They seem to have worked well in societies which are culturally very homogeneous, like the Nordic countries, as such, where strangers are mostly invisible and the majority of the population don't really consider them to be a threat or to have benefited from state largesse. On the contrary, in multicultural and multiracial societies like the countries in South Asia or in the UK, in the US, there is a growing awareness that equality, equal opportunity, the process of empowering the marginalized, and the critique of government and social issues, these aren't really benefiting the status quo, and rather they're creating a conflict of ideas. There are some people, of course, who have uh, embraced the idea of an egalitarian community, but there are others who have not. And there is a steady and perhaps widening gulf between the supporters of the status quo and systemic change and the people who don't really want to embrace this change. So we can find the historical roots of this tortuous relationship to the rejuvenation of the idea of the civil society in the 1970s. The civil society had emerged to varying degrees of efficacy and magnitude across the world. It emerged mainly as a counterbalance to state led economic and political modernization that often left many people desiring more voice and autonomy in the process. So it was meant to challenge institutional structures, and it was supposed to better the condition of the traditionally deprived and marginalized people. It never really represented majority view, but rather a self-righteous, often elitist sense of greater good, progress, and it didn't really reflect popular opinion all the time. Uh, Different sorts of civil societies have emerged across the world. A particular pattern emerged in the West. There emerged several non Western trajectories of civil society, which was either entangled with or independent of the Western ideas of civil society. While most of the Western civil society is considered cultural difference and its recognition as a key imperative for democracy, diversity was a serious problem for post colonial states like India, for example, that could not simply appreciate diversity, but it had to triumph over diversity and multiplicity. There were lots of clashes between distinct and generally sanctimonious ideologies of identity, power, and culture. So they have been simmering for a while. But the origins and manifestations of these conflicts have been very specific to certain contexts. Since the 2000s, that is, in the 21st century, the reality of this clash between different strands of ideas have been terribly unsettling, and it has gained in prominence as the flaws in democracy has been writ large in India and also in some of the other largest and most politically influential countries in the world. There are some states which have appreciated and implemented diversity, but there is always the impulse of exclusionary nationalism, the drive to maintain a strong nation state. There is far right activism as not exactly in opposition to, but as complementary to far left wing activism. And there are different forms of chauvinism which has deepened across the globe. More borders have closed than visa regulations have been eased between different countries. So if we go on Twitter, every day we see complaints about not getting visa appointments on time, or even if we get appointments, we get very disappointing results after spending a lot of money and effort into making the visa application. And that doesn't really apply to one country, but almost every country across the world. There have been symbolic boundaries which have been put up to divide citizens of a country. It has led to violence that often has the state's support as well. The turn of events have been blamed on a variety of factors, from the failure of neoliberalism to the endemic nature of violence, so on and so forth. But the tension between the states and the people's political and consumer needs have played a significant role in how cultural resources are circulated across the world. These tendencies have exploded into mass reckoning very powerfully in the 21st century, because mainly due to the exponential growth of the media and communication technologies. The main problem with the world that we are living in is that we are supposed to be a society of equals, but we're not really sure how to achieve equality or even how to conceptualize equality. So, Pierre Rosanvallon had written a book called The Society of Equals, and he argues that a vast majority of the people are aware of inequality and injustice, but very few of them actually demand political changes to make things right. Equality doesn't really come from accepting social differences or reducing differences between people, but it has to come from a shared empathy, a shared social bond, which is created by empathy, similarity, independence of thought, sometimes even citizenship and identity markers like that. Rosenfellow basically outlines an idea of generating equality through reciprocity of different sorts and engendering commonality. And he has this concept of singularity, which is rather telling, because singularity is like, as opposed to insularity, is the acknowledgement of a person's distinctive characteristics, and it engenders reciprocity by recognizing difference as no less valid than similitude as a building block of society. So the recognition of singularity in several democratic countries has arguably reduced discrimination based on difference, and it has brought some positive changes in state policies and in general the public's attitude towards women or queer communities, racial and minority ethnic groups in many countries, particularly in Western Europe. But at the same time, The accommodation of differences has also led to political fragmentation in most of these nations. The members of the public sphere can be anxious about the nation state's dissolution because they often get really irritated with the shift in the government's policy from, say, acculturation to multiculturalism, because a lot of people in the UK think that all the immigrants should become proper UK citizens. They should support the UK or English or British national teams in sport. That's kind of a litmus test of one's loyalty towards their adoptive nation. And however, the UK government's tendency has been to accept difference and multiculturalism rather than making migrants, rather than assimilating migrants into a known and defined culture of Britishness or Englishness. Even defining what is English and what is British is terribly difficult because the boundaries between these two identities are very fluid, and people define them according to their privileges and their the advantages that these identifications provide them. So it's fairly difficult to fixate on a national identity in a multicultural society like the UK. And a similar problem can also be seen in countries like India, which is manifested in a very different form. There are certain political regimes who have legitimized discontent against particular communities, who have ordinarily cohabited the same territory for centuries, and those who do not really conform to the majoritarian versions of nationhood. So, how does cricket really help us understand these dynamics of world society? So there are mainly three identity projects that I will be talking about in this project. We have seen contradictions in the efforts of various government to assimilate minority ethnic groups under the rubric of citizenship. The results of the policy of respecting rather than erasing difference has been rather inconsistent. What minorities desire and what their adoptive countries are willing and able to provide is sometimes balanced very delicately, and they're often incompatible. Nation states often undertake massive and expensive plans for minority improvement, like the UK government's measures to promote cricket among the South Asian immigrants communities. There are separate leagues for Hindus in Brighton or Muslims in East London, which are good in a way because the MCC and the ECP are pumping money into developing grassroots level cricket and tapping into the already existing enthusiasm and expertise in cricket from the immigrant communities. But on the other hand, by undertaking these sorts of tournaments which are separate from the mainstream and more balanced and inclusive cricket tournaments organized by the ECB, they are also separating identities to a very incompatible level. So these options don't really work that well for the nation state. So there are internal differences all the time. There are class segments among the different racial and ethnic communities, but these are often overlooked by these overarching massive projects undertaken by cricket boards or the national governments. So even these sorts of welfare policies can become very problematic, just as the lack of these policies. The ideology of diversity often reduces, though it doesn't really minimize, communitarian inequalities, like the differences between different sections of the Muslim community around Bradford or Leeds or London who think and do things very differently. And cricket doesn't really erase these differences, but rather these sorts of separatist tournaments even amplifies these sorts of problems and internal dissensions that has riven these communities for decades, and cricket doesn't really stop these problems. Rather, it just it gives more voice to these problems when it's undertaken by these sorts of communities. There have been other social movements as well, but even they have been undermined by various factors, which can be observed in grassroots level cricket in the UK, such as their leaders yielding to political opportunities, or they resorting to misdirected protest tactics. They often try to make space for new groups, but they don't really want that to mean depletion of privilege for oneself. So it shouldn't really come as a surprise that experiments with cultural pluralism and social justice have not really succeeded as much as it should have. Some scholars even argue that the European state sponsored integration policies were really ill informed and they were doomed from the very beginning. Identities at the peripheries can be consolidated, but even the cleavages of identity are just deepening by the day, and which is evident in most of the countries around the world. The answer to this question, so why does this happen and what's the way forward, it's really driven by the context. And most of the research on this has been focused on Western liberal democracies. The idea of a liberal democracy is declining rather fast, but there is this tendency among many scholars to see the West as a stand-in for the world and the rest as mere imitations of Western modernity. And this sorts of scholarship deflects attention from the West's internal contradictions. They have done it for a long time, and these issues have come into some reckoning as late as in the 1990s, and they have been given more prominence in global academia in the 21st century. There are narrow provincialisms, and there are scholars like Partho Chatterjee who has uh, undertaken extremely well informed and well argued discussions on popular movements, authoritarian leaders, the visible fragility of national institutions. So he argues that these sorts of West minded or West inclined scholars often tend to overlook the prevalence of similar structures in African and Asian countries for ages, sometimes primarily as a legacy of colonial rule. The governments of some of the most stable democracies in the world, such as the UK and France, are coming apart in some spectacular manner, which is befitting neophyte nation states. Like, people had their premonitions about whether India would be able to survive even a decade into the 1950s, but it did. So these neophyte nation states had very little experience with statecraft. They had barely in control over power and public sentiment. They were just learning these ropes, and they just learned from their own experience. And some of the Western democracies are facing the same troubles at this very moment. So, but most of these narratives of decolonization and nation building in the 1950s and 60s, which informs my current project on how sport was built into the narrative of decolonization and into generating more power and respect for a British Empire which was in decline. So these sorts of ambivalent historical narratives have only recently started coming into the fore in Western academia. Post-colonial democracies like India have operated with a very carefully curated governmental populism throughout these years. They have mobilized support for one's party or ideology. The Congress government has done it for decades. Now it's the BJP's part. And populism is very conspicuously endemic in India as the main ideology or the main mechanism of doing national politics. It's the same in many other nations. India is not really very singular in this regard, but it was not necessarily absent, but rather camouflaged in the Western countries for a long time. And when it finally reared its head, the lore of the primordial nation and the problems wrought by singularity and reciprocity became rather convenient conduits of its expression. There are widespread anxieties about populism and how the nation state really benefits certain communities or really privileges one communities over others have become one of the buzzwords of like economic and political analysis in the last 20 or so years. Most of the countries in the world perhaps is now being ruled by demagogues and their supporters who criticize the idea of equality. They think that people are being just simply politically correct when they talk about equality, and henceforth equality is kind of an untenable concept. The decline of the nation is perceived rather than reflected in most of the cases when people really get pissed when uh, they think that they are being marginalized and other people are being unfairly privileged. So the idea of decline has been doing the rounds in the Western democracies for some time, particularly in the UK, where this theory of declinism, rather than the real specter or the real incident or event of decline, has been manifest for the last 30, 40 years. The UK people have been thinking that they are in decline since they lost their empire largely. So the incident or event of decline, even when it really happens and it's not merely theoretical, it's often very conveniently blamed on various aspects of modern liberal and socialist thought, such as equality, secularism, internationalism, multiculturalism. Some scholars have identified in the eye of the storm a populist movement which is catalyzed by unfulfilled demands mostly. There are several political parties like the One Nation in Australia, the Sri Lanka People's Front in Sri Lanka, the African National Congress in South Africa. They have been practicing populism for decades with varying degrees of success. And in addition to a widespread anxiety about the changing structure of society, there we have seen emerging a fear of one's country being subsumed under an identity which is rather undesirable, or worse, it can lead to a compromise of the nation's symbols of sovereignty. So, national identity really has a strong foundation of community feeling that creates boundaries against outsiders. And the boundary of identity is generally protected against potential harm or devolution. Any movement of subversive ideas across the boundary, change in political economy, an unexpected experience of class, these all create a sense of panic in the community. And the political content of this disaffection is not always the hallmark of right wing or conservative thinking, which are usually blamed for perpetuating politics of division and differentiation. But in fact, uh, for complex multicultural entities like India and the UK, the architectonics of national identity often encompass a number of often contradictory political commitments. They often work at cross purposes and they render the idea of national identity rather fragmented and sometimes even illusory. There are some self designated progressive, liberal, and left wing regimes who too have been guilty of authoritarianism, mass deportation, mass execution, suppression of dissident voice, creating trade barriers, creating problems with mobility of people, and they often sell arms to countries with very poor human rights records. So it's not really a right wing, left wing problem, but rather it's a very general problem that has affected the entire globe. So all of us have had experiences or brushes with highly geological speeches, the texts of which can be very transient, but they kind of shape shift into other forms of political hate speeches. And some of these speeches have been really durable in the last 20 years or so. There has been reinforcing of borders, doubts over social inclusion. uh, Modern consumer citizens, and those particularly in the West, have facilitated the corporatization of world economy. We have seen the emergence of a transnational capitalist class. We we find it very comfortable to think that the barriers are going down, but they are not really. So we have seen hollow declarations of anti-capitalism. They aren't always hollow, but they have not really been as effective as their proponents would have you believe. So this is the kind of state of insecurity that forms the backdrop of my next research project. So it's set against this context in which we have seen the coexistence of contrasting ideologies, which has received immense public visibility and concern. And I would like to argue that cricket is a it's a potential tool of understanding how nations have been shaped by internationalism, populism, diversity, inclusion, exclusion, assimilation, acculturation, multiculturalism, corporate interests, and so on in the 21st century. There are a number of important studies which have addressed the relationship between sport, nationalism, national identity, and politics. They have considered, and some of them really well, uh, how sport has led both region-centric identity formation and um, also some of the global campaigns for equality and equity for traditionally disadvantaged sections of the population. And the body of works about the relationship between sport and nations have interrogated various aspects of imperial, colonial, racial, ethnic, cultural, populist, very different sorts of nationalism. So there are maybe 20, 30 types. So scholars have engaged with more or less all of them. And the body of work is considerably large. And they have also keenly observed the rise of global ties and networks in cricket, and they have produced a number of studies focused on the circulation of the courts of cricket, the migration of athletes, the organization of tournaments on a global scale, and the consequent um, transnational and cosmopolitan manifestations of sport in general. But the research that I envisage is going to be the first book, hopefully, that combines the perspectives of these genres of research to navigate the contemporary global power relations, identities, and political philosophies in 8 or 10 countries spread across the world. And the focus on a single sport, which is cricket, rather than a multiplicity of sport in these nations, it, I think, provides a very coherent analytical tool, unlike in other relevant books that consider a number of sport, because every sport has its own history and its own logic of production and consumption. So using a number of sports as case studies can lead to very incompatible and conflicting conclusions, which I try to steer clear of. So I think a single sport research project or book can capture its subject in greater complexity, and it can lend more credence to comparative and global studies. So this is more or less the basic context of my research, and in whatever remains of this talk, I would just discuss one very relevant case study that probably all of us know about in great detail. Some of you would know it even in more complexity than me, which is what happened in the wake of the Pulwama attack in 2019, and what does that really tell us about contemporary manifestations of diplomacy, nationhood, and the use of cricket as like a cultural resource, as a political tool, as a force of anti-diplomacy, and which has had like wide reverberations and repercussions for the wider cricketing world in general. So in 2019, a car filled with explosive had crashed into an Indian military convoy in near the town of Pulwama, which led to the death of many army personnel, presumably 40 or 46 was the figure. So this was not a singular event, but it was rather like it was probably the most atrocious event in a chain of suicide attacks on Indian armed forces in places such as Pathankot or Uri, which has been made very famous by a movie. Uh, Most of the time after these attacks, the Indian media has claimed that the various Pakistan based and Pakistan backed Islamist militant groups have orchestrated or led the attack. And after the 2019 attack on Pulwama, the group called Jaish-e-Mohammed, JEM in short, they took full responsibility for the attack. So they were responsible for the strike. Pakistan denied involvement in the attack, but many Indian politicians blamed them for harboring terrorists. There are some Pakistani newspapers which fueled more criticism, like they added fuel to the fire which has been lit by Indian politicians by claiming that these terrorist outfits or the people associated with these acts, they are freedom fighters, they have done really well in teaching India a lesson. The identity of these terrorists were not really clear, as a Jaish-e-Mohammed spokesperson later told the same newspaper, which I think was The Nation, which is published from Lahore, that their organization was not really involved with the attack, which was in contradiction with what the Indian news media was circulating at the moment. But Indian politicians and also Pakistani politicians as well on the other side of the border, they were spurred by such claims. They were seething with rage when they made some public proclamations, like the Indian Home Minister at the time was. Uh, the former Indian Home Minister was Rajnath Singh, who was speaking about this Pakistan-based offensive. Arun Jaitley at the time, he vowed an unforgettable lesson for Pakistan for this heinous act. Condolences for the dead poured in from everywhere, from the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka and from the United Nations Security Council. There were donations for the families of the deceased, which flowed from all over India and even from inmates of prisons in Bihar. Even they donated money uh, for the upliftment of the family of the martyrs. What was more interesting for me, this was definitely a really unfortunate act of terrorism, but what really struck me in the wake of this attack was how cricket was used as a tool to justify the Indian government's response to certain diplomatic negotiations with Pakistan, or rather, the Indian government's effort to isolate Pakistan from the world community. Um, the Indian Premier League had banned Pakistani cricketers from taking part in the league in 2009 following the allegations of Pakistan's complicity in the infamous 26/11 attacks in Mumbai. The situation in 2019 unfolded very differently because the cricket industry took a very unprecedented step and decisions that were not really directly demanded by the national government, but most of the time they took the decisions on their own. There was this broadcaster of the Pakistan Super League, the PSL, in India called D Sports. So they stopped the telecast of the Pakistan Super League the day after the attack, saying they were sensitive to national issues. Nearly all the provincial cricket associations in India uh, removed the photographs of Pakistani cricketers or teams from their balconies or from their museums. Most famously, the Cricket Club of India in Mumbai. They didn't really remove Imran Khan's portrait, but they covered Imran Khan's portrait so that people didn't really knew that this portrait existed in the galleries. The only association to refuse to do so was Bengal. The president of the CAB at the time was sort of Ganguly, and he was rumored to be in close concert with the provincial government led by the Trinamool Congress, who was one of the like main electoral opponents of the BJP. And we know that Modi and Didi have no love lost between them. So whatever Modi proposes, Didi disposes. So the news media decoded Ganguly's refusal to remove Imran Khan's portrait from the clubhouse as a proxy war between these two political parties, using the Cricket Association of Bengal as the conduit. However, the BCCI was very enthusiastic in its response towards collecting money for the families of the fallen. They cancelled the opening ceremony of the Indian Premier League in that year, and they donated the entire budget to the military and the families of the victims. So, which was like more than £2 million in value. So, a huge amount. So they gave money to the families, to the Navy, to the Air Force, to the land based army, to everybody, every section of the army. At the time, BCCI was governed by the a committee of administrators appointed by the Supreme Court, which has since been dissolved. And one of the members of the COA was Diana Edulji, and he commented that the organization had always been sensitive towards issues of national interest. The BCCI uh, sent a deputation to the International Cricket Council, the ICC, a strongly worded letter to sever ties with countries from which terrorism emanated, and that unequivocally did refer to Pakistan. So Indian cricketers after that decided to play a match against Australia in the following month in Ranchi, sporting camouflage military caps, and donated the fees of the match, which amounted to a lot of money to the National Defense Fund. And the donation was indeed a very kind gesture, but the use of military symbol on the field of sport started a controversy. And Pakistan protested against this, but the ICC buckled under pressure, and they said that it was a humanitarian cause, and they were right in allowing the Indian cricketers to sport a military decoration on their bodies at an international cricket match. However, the ICC has been very strict in punishing the likes of Moeen Ali for sporting bands inscribed with phrases like "Free Gaza" or "Free Palestine," because apparently that was the incursion of politics into the field of cricket, which was rather unsavory. But however, this was made an exception because India is the fattest boy in the canoe. When we move, everybody else moves to adjust our presence. So it was really a time of distrust and acrimony. And then the Indian government claimed to lead an airstrike and destroying the Jaish-e-Mohammed training camps in Pakistan. They were criticized by the Pakistani government and some political parties within India itself, who claimed that this entire encounter was fake. It didn't really happen. We don't really have to go into that. Whether it happened or not doesn't really concern us. But at this point, some political commentators who trained a keen eye on the happenstances on the field of cricket, they feared an apparent subsuming of cricket under jingoistic politics. Some people claim that uh, the fusion of cricket and politics was a humanitarian gesture, And some people didn't really buy that argument. In their turn, Pakistan asked the ICC to chastise India for using cricket for politics. But this is a known fact that cricket has always been extensively used by politicians, athletes, and common people to express their aspirations and sentiments and to benefit from their association with cricket. So, cricket has always helped politicians put values into their actions. There are some people who indulge in wishful thinking that cricket is a pure form of art, it must not be tainted by politics or any concern which is unrelated as to what is happening outside the field of play. But just as music is political, theater is political, cricket ever be free of politics? It was very political from its inception in India, which was 300 years ago in 1721. So nationalism is good so long as it's limited to waving flags or painting national symbols on faces of people. But whenever there is a threat that cricket would be enmeshed with politics, are these purists who would really consider this to be a debauchery. They would not want cricket to be associated with politics, saying that they don't really mix. But national identity and nationalism has always been at the forefront of how cricket has been organized and played and perceived by the vast multitude of people in South Asia and also outside South Asia. And cricket excites this sorts of nationalist passion, and it informs the debates on national identity because elite cricket is primarily international. It's a contest between two nations, and we know that a lot of cultural and social and political investment goes into the making of a nation and national identities. And a clash on the cricket field is essentially a clash of different national identities and the aspirations of these people. So we can't really say that cricket has ever been divorced from the greater context of nation building through sport or through cultural resources in general. So a couple of years ago, or maybe 3 years ago, Prashant Kidambi wrote a book called Cricket Country, and in which he argued that for many Indians, uh, the cricket team is the nation. They celebrate its victories as national triumphs and mourns their defeats as national disasters. So we have seen a transition of cricket's fortune and cricket's identification in the world. Uh, through the last couple of centuries. So, in the early 19th century, it was essentially a rural English game. It was called a standing panegyric to the English countryside and English character. And now, historians such as Ashish Nandy are claiming that cricket is an Indian game accidentally discovered by the British, which is really more polemical than analytical, but the sentence really says a lot, and we can devote like endless discussions on whether he was justified in making this polemic. So this this transition in cricket's nature and identity has a distinctly political discourse. It has played a immense nation making, and if not nation building, at least nation making role in the British world, like England, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, West Indies. We have known the works of CLR James, Beyond the Boundary, which is probably the best cricket book ever written, if not the best sport book ever written. And for James, the cultural was always the political, and he was really interested in exploring how the cultural aspect of cricket encoded or complicated and even sometimes anticipated the ideological discourses of cricket. And for him, culture, in short, was kind of a series of ascribed political articulations. And for him, culture itself could constitute instructive politics. So he was totally invested in his belief that for the formation of West Indian national identity in the period of decolonization in the 1950s and 60s, cricket played a very instructive and powerful role. So that can be exemplified by thousands of anecdotes. I'll provide just one. 1956 or 7, the Prime Minister of Barbados was supposed to address the nation, and suddenly somebody in the government cabinet realized that a very important match, the day of the speech coincided with the final day of a very important match with Jamaica. So what happens? The prime minister postpones the speech because cricket comes before any articulation of the nation. So cricket is the nation for West Indies, and to a large extent it's for most of India as well. There are of course parts of India which are not really interested in cricket, but well, we can't really make a huge totalizing claims that if Bombay thinks cricket is terribly important, the India can't really think cricket is very important. But for the majority of the people, of course, cricket is something that is inescapable. Whether or not you like cricket, it's out there as a political force, and it determines how the nation experiences international politics or diplomacy, and how it conducts diplomacy, or it just conducts its external affairs with other nations. So politics has been baked into the culture of cricket to such an extent that India Pakistan matches are simply not about cricket anymore. Indian Muslims are routinely vilified as anti nationals for supporting Pakistan against India. They think, the majority thinks that they're adherents of pan Islamism. The competition has everything to do with their shared history of political tension and violence. So this is why we have some strange advertisements which are beamed at the time of the World Cup. Before the 2019 World Cup, when the acrimony between India and Pakistan was at its height, we had this ad in which a character which symbolized India claimed himself to be the father of Pakistan, and the father was kind of a shorthand for a position of authority. And it, Pakistani advertisers reciprocated, such as the Jazz Mobile company uh, put out an advertisement in which they made a spoof of Avinandan Vartaman, the guy who got into Pakistani soil, and he was captured in the Pakistani army after his dogfight with a Pakistani aircraft, and then he was released as a goodwill gesture, and that's how the like that small battle of 2019 had ended. So he was held captive by the Pakistani army, and he was interrogated. So we have seen videos in which we have seen that he was offered tea, but he refused to divulge anything regarding his mission. So there was talks in India about awarding him some award for gallantry, which was duly given. But the advertisement played on this incident, and it featured an unseen voice from the background asking a tea drinking doppelganger of the wing commander about the Indian team's composition for the World Cups. Who are the players who's going to be there in the World Cup, who will be playing against Pakistan? Vartaman didn't really, like the doppelganger of Vartaman, didn't really reveal anything, and he was permitted to go. But the cup which was in his hand, the cup from which he was drinking tea, here symbolized the World Cup, and that was wrested from his hand, which didn't really happen in reality before he left. So they let the person go, but they kept the World Cup for themselves. So nationalism is ultimately a war that we wage upon those who don't really fit in, and cricket has provided an excellent field for a proxy war. whenever India plays Pakistan at the World Cup or otherwise, there are millions, if not billions, of total viewership across the world. Um, there are huge commercial implications for this intense national rivalry as well. Any match involving India and Pakistan is not really watched for its sporting performance anymore, but for many people, it's more savory for the sense of nationalism that it evokes. And cricket has also fostered some unforeseen amenities across the border. Apparently, Pakistani youngsters love the Indian captain Virat Kohli, not captain anymore, and they try to ape his batting technique and body movements. One of them had even been arrested by the Pakistani police for displaying the Indian national flag after one of Kohli's great performances, which was fairly commonplace until then, before COVID. So, in this way, cricket has assigned meanings to a sense of national identity. It has created a narrative of belonging that makes ideological connections, or it sometimes alienates various people and places. In countries like England or the West Indies, cricket's popularity is in decline, but it's still, even in this phase, it continues to produce distinctions between classes, racial prejudices, gender inequalities, and problems of identity, which continue to plague the post colonial world as such. So, cricket kind of molds and reflects political discourses so well that the game and nationalism as such are kind of like kissing cousins within a fragmented family. The nation is still very much pertinent in cricket because international cricket is essentially contest between nations. So the nation states are the main organizers of sporting teams, and cri- competition in cricket has not really been usurped by transnational sport governing bodies in the manner as people had surmised in the 1990s with the rise of Worldtel and other global bodies and their massive interest in sponsoring cricket. But national governments are perennially in transit in conversation with the organizers of cricket, maybe the BCCI, the ECB, WICB, everywhere. And they continue to leverage their political and financial power to retain control over cricket. And sometimes they are even sanctioned for exerting unfair influence over their cricketing bodies, but they don't really care. And more importantly, perhaps, cricket followers draw extensive inspiration from their national or their regional context to give meaning to their sporting encounters. So even though we cannot really purely frame cricket as a national or a global endeavor, because cricket continues to broaden the possibility of inclusion by enabling formerly marginalized groups to make themselves heard through sport. But we have seen that it can also be a very powerful tool of exclusion, which was famously started by the British Conservative MP Norman Tebbit, who, in one of his most infuriating speeches in the early 1990s, claimed that the loyalty of South Asian immigrants to their countries of origin was weakening British nationhood. And we still hear echoes of those sorts of primordial sentiments about a pure nationhood even today. And that really reflects through the electoral propaganda that are all around us. The Tebet test is still routinely invoked to gauge the loyalty of Indian Muslims when India played Pakistan. And sometimes even cricketers participate in that. In 2018 or 19, we perhaps all of us remember, there was this Indian fan who tweeted that he enjoyed watching English and Australian batsmen more than Indians. And Virat Kohli responded, "So why are you living in the country and loving other countries?" I don't think you should live in one country and like other things. So get your priorities right, something like that. So the sentiment expressed here is hardly any different from Tibet's expectation of seamless integration into a totalizing society, which has been a buzzword in most of the larger democracies in the contemporary world. So Kohli's tweet in this sort, it unlocked a very key political dynamic of our times, which is one of the relapses of modern democracies from world building to nation building. So the nation has become more important than the world, and the nation has indeed returned with a vengeance. So we can see patriotism, nationalism, all components in the politics of difference broadly defined, which are really constructed around certain cultural resources, and cricket is kind of no exception. And for these concepts of identity to operate, we replace one tradition by another, and the nature of hierarchy changes as well as a result. And the subjects of change acquire new identities. And in countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Sri Lanka, in which cricket kind of rules over most other cultural resources, it provides the communities living within these countries a very dynamic space as well as social and cultural capital, which enables them to negotiate different sorts of identities. It may be gender, sexual, ethnic, racial, religious, and so on. So it has been a very powerful medium of shaping identities for a large number of people. We have spoken about national distinctiveness in cricket. It really doesn't really consist in fans wearing national colors or chanting about their national teams in unison. It goes far beyond that. It is created and reinforced by the same politics of belonging that reifies citizenship and participation in a national community as opposed to a global community. So I hope that my next book will take a critical step forward in analyzing the broader performative or affective or representational significance of these conditions, and how cricket has been a conduit of this global situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Naha. That has been an excellent lecture. I cannot remember when it was the last time I enjoyed a lecture this much. It was very engrossing. We have quite a few questions. I would ask Shubham to flash these questions on the screen. Maybe it will be easier for you. Should I
And
read them out or is it fine? Yeah.
okay. So how podcast and cricket have been associated with caste identity, the formation of a true nation and national culture, Indian perspectives only. Prashanto, that's a very important question, because caste is probably one of the most important identity markers in India, and that's something that we can't really do about. It continues to create new divisions across societies, and even though we claim to have moved towards a more sorry about that, a more inclusive society, there are stories of violence against the lower castes perpetrated by the so-called upper castes, which are circulated in the news media almost every day. And cricket has not really been outside the ambit of the caste system. So there have been studies such as one by Sirivayan Anand, who had written a very well-informed book called Brahmins and Cricket, even though he had overgeneralized caste oppression and its relations with the chief organizers of cricket, whom he identified to be from the upper castes. And he thought that there was systematic discrimination against the inclusion of lower caste cricketers in the Indian national team. That can be partially true, even though there is absolutely no evidence other than a few interviews, most recently by Dota Ganesh, who came out in 2019 saying that he was definitely offended by how sometimes his teammates behaved around him. And he definitely felt discriminated. So that's the one story that we have. I'm sure there are plenty others. The general problem is that cricket is very expensive to play, so the bat costs 15,000 rupees. There are gloves, pads, helmets, even the cricket ball, the shoes. They all come up to say 25,000 or 30,000. So at the grassroots level, it's very difficult for traditionally economically disadvantaged groups to pursue the sport professionally as a livelihood. Most of the people just give up uh, after a point because they can't really afford to go into training sessions which can be very far from the place that you live in. And there is ground to believe that the upper caste people traditionally have more economic and cultural resources than the so-called lower caste people, so they have been more successful in cricket. So it's really a problem in the system rather than any persistent sense of discrimination against cricketers. But the main thing is there have been so few Dalit cricketers, and even then, nobody has ever spoken up against discrimination or any issues regarding their caste identity, that we barely know anything about how discrimination has been meted out towards certain cricketers and how people have responded to it, coped with it, resisted it. We barely have any information.
Uh, Thank you. Yeah, there's the next question on the screen.
Thanks for the question. Why is it that in cricket assumes such an important role in Indian nationalism and not football? Okay, considering India specifically Calcutta's connection with the football. Well, my first book is coming out in maybe a couple of months. So it's with the press, with the printers. And in the introduction, I had to write 3 pages justifying why it's a book on cricket and why cricket is the ideal tool of understanding the making of post-colonial Calcutta and not football. So I really had to make my case very airtight because most of the people in Calcutta love football more than cricket. And few people go to Ranji Trophy matches or to see first class or second division cricket in the city. There are more audiences, like significantly more audiences for football. Football used to take place across the year, and cricket was confined to mainly one season. And when it came to international cricket, so we hosted test matches maybe once every 3 or 4 years. So definitely, as a marker of Bengali nationhood, Bengali culture, etc., football is like a very important tool of understanding this dynamics. However, cricket has a more global and international role to play in the construction of Indian nationhood because India has systematically performed better in international cricket than in football. And since the popularity of football was not really ever limited to Calcutta, but there are some parts of India like Hyderabad or Kerala or Calcutta, which have been the powerhouses of football for like more than a century, and other parts of India, football weren't really taken that seriously by the mass media for a long time. I don't really mean to say that football had a less nation building role than cricket. So there is a very interesting files which you can find in the National Archives, which dates back to 1957. The Ministry of Education had asked the major physical education establishments of every province to make a list of the top 5 most popular sport in the country. So there were some 24 or 25 states in India at the time. cricket topped the list in only two of the states, and football topped the list in like 17, 18 states. And in Calcutta, the home of the famous Eden Gardens, cricket didn't even feature in the top five. So we have reasons to believe that football was more important for the majority of the people. However, at the same time, if you look at the major newspapers of the time, if it had like a couple of pages devoted to sport, you would find news of cricket in one page and the news of every other sport in the other page. So for the news media, which were read by a large number of lettered people of the times. At that time, in the 1950s and 60s, the number of literate people in India was kind of like 20% of the entire population. It has grown steadily. But at the time, the people who we didn't have social media, the people who ruled over the public sphere was generally the elite, upper class, often foreign educated or well educated in general people who had a predilection for cricket. So they made very tall claims about cricket and its nation building role, its character building role, about how great the sport is, but they didn't really make such claims about football or hockey or any other sport. However, those narratives have remained, and with telling and retelling numerous times, they have been entrenched in our collective psyche to such an extent that we can't even think about giving a nation building role to any other sport other than cricket.
Okay, that was very enlightening. We have another question. That question seems to have broken into two parts because of, I think, YouTube's limited characters. Should I read it out to you? Or maybe I can send it in the chat. Maybe you can read it
Okay,
there as well. Yeah.
okay, okay.
It is
So, yeah.
from Shubham Dotto of English department. Yeah.
Thanks, Shubham, for the question. If you look at the tour to Pakistan after 5 years, cricket was again weaponized to forge a goal of political harmony rather than perpetuating enmity. The differences between these two similar yet distinct types of political linkages with. Yeah, that's a very interesting point that I will definitely address in my research. The thing is that we have known a lot of things about political Islam and how a religious ideology can be weaponized to create a political understanding of culture. And we have also come to a juncture in which we have been doing the same about other religions as well. And recently we have seen lots of works from the likes of Thomas Blom Hansen or Christoph Jaffelot about how Hindu political identity has underwent a sea change from the inception of the BJP in the 1980s to the 2021s and 22s, and how things have unfolded in the past 7 8 years after the BJP government came to power in 2014. So there is a change in preference for cultural resources to strengthen their political ideology. The leaders of the nation back then in 2004, they had a very different vision for cricket and a very different vision for India's role in the international order and its relationship with their neighbors. That has underwent changes with a transition in the political ideology of the same party. So they are not really very similar with the change of personal and the change of orientation of how to conduct their politics and the change in their attitude towards cricket uh, amply summarizes what has really changed in the Indian political scenario and who are the people who have led these changes. There is no doubt that political bigwigs had always been at the helm of administering or governing cricket. So back in 2014, Narendra Modi was the president of the Gujarat Cricket Association. The responsibility was then delegated to Amit Shah, and then Amit Shah became the home minister, and somebody else got that position. And Amit Shah's son is still the secretary of the BCCI, which is the second most important post in uh, in the cricket body. And also, we have seen many other politically motivated appointments, such as the Jammu and Kashmir Cricket Board has been recently reshaped, and with the last election, they have seen a change in their personnel. And right now, even though BJP is a political minority in that province, the cricket board is populated with BJP affiliates who have been ministers or secretaries in their cabinets previously. So there has been this tendency to encroach into cricket governance, which was always there. There were people like Param Sivan Subbarayan, who was India's after 1945, he was the board president. Then Anthony Di Mello. All of them were pretty close with the Congress government of the time. Subbarayan even became the governor of Madras and even a cabinet minister under Nehru. So political encroachment into cricket is nothing new. But the changing character of this encroachment is very much visible in terms of resource allocation, uh, different attitudes which have come to the fore towards different cricketers. So whenever there is a cricketer from Pakistan, such as Parvez Rasool, and then Umran Malik, who play for the national team, we see hue and cries. There are some people in the media who extol India's tolerance and diversity. It's a celebration of diversity for them. At the same time, there are people who think it's kind of a Kashmir quota, and all these things have merged into a very impertinent imbroglio in the last 5 or 6 years because of the changed political situation, in which the preferences of politicians and the way that they try to run cricket has become very different. Krishanu, thanks for the question. With the introduction of several lucrative cricket leagues across the world, don't you think that is a sense of dissolution of national identity as it was earlier in the 90s? Again, that's a very pertinent question. There are concerns, or there were concerns, that franchisee cricket would become so popular that it would eventually replace international cricket, like franchisee football or franchisee hockey has done in other countries. In no other sport, the nation was even remotely as important to the followers of a sport as in cricket. However, there are some problems flagged by Australian commentators on cricket, some of whom have been really irritated by how the BBL and the ensuing uh, identifications with certain franchises have been destabilizing one's loyalty towards the nation. There are concerns raised by the West Indies Cricket Board suggesting that their brand of franchisee cricket has been eroding national identity to an extent. However, there have been steps taken to prevent that. In that sense, the International Cricket Council has been like extremely strong and proactive, because they organize, or they permit the organization of franchise cricket to such an in a way that it doesn't really interfere with the general schedule of international cricket. So there are certain problems, and West Indies is facing a huge depletion of its cricketing resources, because most of their most famous and competent cricketers would prefer to play franchisee cricket rather than cricket for their own nation, which is devaluing national performance. But other countries have been more proactive in like eradicating this sorts of problems from their cricketing framework. They don't even allow their cricketers, they don't give them clearance to play for other leagues when national duty calls. And the BCCI in particular, they have shown extreme resilience to the suspicion that national identity and nationalism would can eventually erode with the growing popularity of the IPL. They don't even allow most Indian cricketers who have been otherwise sitting idle or playing domestic cricket to go out and play in the UK or the Australian franchisee cricket leagues at all.
Thank you so much for taking that time to answer all the questions in such detail. Uh, I think now I will ask Professor Durba Mukherjee to take over and deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Sneha.
Thank you so much, Neha.
And thank you, Dr. Naha, for that very interesting talk, and in fact, for introducing the problematics of the polemic of incorporation of cricket in today's exclusionist, jingoist nationalism that a fraction of people, let's call citizens, who pursue the tangent within the purview of nationalism. And also, it had been indeed pleasant to hear about the simultaneously divergent tangent that basically voices its dissent against such exclusionism, that too cricket unfolds. So I am sure that all of us have very immensely enjoyed the talk. And good luck with your next book. I would like to thank here the entire department of Gokhale Memorial Girls College, who have put together the work to put up this entire series of talks, an evening with an expert. I'm sure it had been an incredible learning experience since then. And my thanks to our patron, Dr. Otto Shikarfa, who's the principal of Gokhale Memorial College. So, with that, I hand it over again to you, Sneha, to wrap up the talk. I think that's it
Well,
for
thank you
today.
so much, Professor, for the very kind words. And I'm really delighted. I've been really delighted. I've been itching to put these thoughts forward just to understand whether I'm going into the right direction. And thank you
Oh,
very much for
sure.
inviting me a
Sure, with
platform.
a nation which is really interested in cricket, as you've pointed it out, the print media has sustained that interest through and through the years. I'm sure that we all have really enjoyed the entire talk. Thank you.
And with that, we have come to an end of today's lecture. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Durbadi. I think we'll end the live streaming now. Shubham, you there?